RenderMan Studio allows you to send the data to a render farm and manage that with a program called Tractor. That's what larger companies use. And finally, RenderMan Pro Server is just the renderer on its own. And that's what you put on your render farm. So yes, very high prices. That's probably what a lot of you are thinking. One of the reasons the prices are fairly high is it's actually there's a lot of quality to it. I'll talk about what the qualities are, but it's worth noting, this was really the only way there was to render for many years, especially when Pixar was first around in the mid-80s. It was designed at a time when it was very, very hard to render computer graphics images. In fact, it was published in 1987. It was designed to meet a number of very major criteria that was hard. The idea, even in '87, we wanted to tackle extreme visual complexity. That meant hundreds of lights, millions of polys, and gigs of textures. Today, multiply all those by 10. It also needed, originally, RenderMan again was made as part of Lucasfilm. It was designed for visual effects, not actually animation. And one of the key elements needed for visual effects is you have to be able to integrate your CG with footage. And real cameras have motion blur and depth of field and bloom. There's a lot of things that make something worth filming that are in real cameras that RenderMan was designed to handle from the beginning. So RenderMan is very well known for its motion blur and depth of field. And finally, memory efficiency. Back in the 80s, 4 megabytes of memory, that was a supercomputer. So now we have 24 gigs without that much trouble, but suffice to say, it's always been possible to render large scenes in RenderMan, so memory management is a key feature. So this statistic I have on the bottom, I don't know what it is currently. I think I found this out in 2004, but at least at that time, 41 out of the past 44 visual effects best visual effects films used PRMan. So it's got a history of success. And in fact, Pixar was awarded an Oscar in 1993 for scientific achievement for RenderMan. So it's got a lot of history to it. This is not nearly all the films that have used it, but these are a bunch of films that I know have used RenderMan. I took this slide from someone else's presentation, but this is a bunch of films that have used it, and the reason is a couple things. One is clearly the image quality is good. Many of you have seen those films. Clearly RenderMan is capable of making very good-looking images. And while many renderers can do good images, RenderMan is also good with speed and stability. Historically, it has been very fast compared to other techniques, especially at those high qualities. The feature set is very fast. Many rendering techniques have been implemented using RenderMan. So things like subsurface scattering to hair rendering to volumetrics, and it's all part of the feature set. But number 4 is actually perhaps the biggest reason why most studios are using RenderMan, just because it's highly customizable. If you have some need of the renderer that isn't there by default, you don't need to go back to Pixar and say, hey, can you implement this for me? There's a lot of room for engineers to create plugins into it and create different techniques, particularly via the shading language. Creating different shaders and materials are very, very easy in RenderMan as compared to in other renderers. But even more fancy things, with C++ and so on, there's a lot of ways you can extend RenderMan. However, that's the hardest thing for me to teach you guys, honestly, is the customizability. Suffice to say it's there, but one of the things you'll note is if you go to a studio that uses RenderMan, it will look different and behave differently in every studio, especially the big ones, because a lot of them have customized it quite differently. So for instance, Leica and Aragon, which made Paranorman and a lot of things that look like stop motion, they use RenderMan. They have their whole different set of ways because they're integrating with stop motion footage, different materials for clay and things that Leica is using than Pixar. or ILM, which always does big robot films. You know, they have their own separate set of tools. So, you know, wherever you go, you'll find RenderMan will be very different because it's been customized differently. But it sort of becomes part of the company that uses it almost when they've integrated it. So, a little bit more on the features that are being used, that RenderMan has to offer. So like I mentioned earlier, depth of field is a big part of photography, footage, that you need to have in CG work to make it look like it's part of it. I am just using CG imagery here because those are the images I have the rights to, but suffice to say, you know, there are lots of live action films that have depth of field and where the imagery has been integrated. And just so you guys know, in case anyone's familiar, depth of field is the aspect of photography such that not everything can be in focus at once typically, as soon as you have an aperture that's not just a point. So shallow depth of field means a lot is out of focus behind and in front of the focal plane, whereas deep depth of field means a lot is in focus. And shallow depth of field is often used to draw the viewer's attention to specific points. So for instance, in this shot, Wally is opening up this box and finds a ring in it, a diamond ring that he throws away because he doesn't know the value. Later when he finds the plant, he knows it's valuable, but you know, they want the viewer to look here at this diamond ring. So we focus in, even though it's a very small object on the screen, by using shallow depth of field, we focus in. This is a common film technique. It applies to animation and computer graphics as well. Another one is motion blur. How do you know these rats are going very fast when they're going out the window here? I'm going to try to pause this in the last frame. I think I can hit the space bar. Pause it. Oh, no space bar. So it's hard for me to see my mouse. Does anyone see my mouse there? Oh, there it is. Well, anyway, you can see at the very end, you can tell the rats are moving fast because they're very blurred. If they weren't blurred, it would look like stop motion or King Kong. You know, you'd have what's called strobing. So it's important to get motion blur looking accurate for footage to look right filming. Now those are camera, techniques. On more the technical side, one of the things RenderMan does very well is what's called displacement. Now displacement is the ability to move a point on the mesh at render time, as opposed to modeling it explicitly in the model. And this is very useful, like in a shot like this in Wally. Let's say you have a trash dump. Picture how many models are in that shot, in those piles of trash back there. It would be incredible if you'd like to actually model that many and duplicate them. You would never have enough memory just to load the shot in Maya, let alone to render it. Rather, those details come from the shader, which takes some simple geometry and at render time displaces it using texture maps and other patterns to look like trash. So you can think of those trash mounds in the background as actually being hills. They're just smooth hills. And then RenderMan, the shader in it, will actually move the points to create that detail as needed. So in a way you can think of the space